Welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to their leaders past, present and emerging. The Understanding Boys podcast is a series of conversations exploring what it is to be a good man these days. And if you had a story that you could tell a boy of, say, 14 and he'd listen, what would that story be? And that's really what I'm asking our guests today. I'm Dr. Ray Swann, and we're a community of teachers and parents concerned with the education and growth of boys and young men in the modern world. This series is brought to you by Brighton Grammar, an all-boys school in Melbourne. To learn more about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. Dr. Monty Badami is a multi-talented individual. He's a musician, a martial artist, he's an academic, he's worked for the Australian Army in the corporate sector, in the university and tertiary areas, but presently he runs an organisation called Habitus, and through this he provides social, emotional and experiential learning programs for families. His work is really quite astounding, and I think as you listen to our short conversation today, you'll discover what it is that so many of us love about Monty Badami. He gives us fantastic advice, things that we can use immediately at home. He helps to provide safe spaces for people to really unpack the prejudices and the ideas that they've kind of set in themselves over time. He also shares a beautiful story about his own experience and what led him to do the work that he does. We hope you enjoy our conversation today. Well, welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. Monty, it's great to have this opportunity to chat, and for our listeners, I'm pleased to say that Monty and I have had a great friendship over a number of years now. So if we sort of fall into some joviality, just a heads up, we're recording this at the end of a working day, and we've just been having a few laughs off mic, and we may bring that into the conversation as well. But Monty, great to be able to have this opportunity to speak with you. Thank you very much, and it's an opportunity for us to be able to connect you to the listeners. So again, thank you for your time.
Hey, absolute pleasure, Ray. Really great to be talking to you again, and I can't wait to see where this conversation takes us.
And Monty, you were saying you just finished a camp. You're up in the mid-central coast of New South Wales, and you do lots of work in an area known as ethnography. And we'll talk a little bit about that because it's an incredible discipline and way of, unpacking what's happening for people and how people are and who they are. Tell us a bit about the camp and some of the work that you do. I think the listeners will find it fascinating.
Yeah. Look, I suppose with the Central Coast for you folks down in Victoria, we considered the south coast of New South Wales. We're down in a lovely place called Clam, and we just had a father and son camp. We do a range of camps. We do teen rites of passage camps, but we also do like Lifehacks camps or for young people who are stepping into adulthood after school. But I think one of my most enjoyable camps is a primary school camp. Having that opportunity to connect with your kids just before they hit that age where things get a little bit real. And look, I am on a bit of a high because it's very, very emotional, really positive, really fulfilling experience. And we just had a stack of dads and their kids in the local area and did a camp just to give them an opportunity to pause and get away from the distractions of daily life and connect with each other and listen to each other and start that process of seeing those young kids for who they are, not for who they were, or not just as the babies that they were, but as the kids that they are, and being able to just appreciate where they're at and open up the lines of communication in preparation for the adolescent years to come.
Yeah, it's absolutely about just making that strong foundation, isn't it? Reconnecting. And I guess also you would see for the parents about how they also need to change the roles that they're playing and the way in which they see themselves in relation to their kids. And, obviously in the nature of this podcast, we're talking a lot about the boys. So what are some of the things you see from parents and how they have to, what are some of the biggest challenges we're getting to that? If I'm listening and I'm in that late primary, early secondary, how do I need to change as a mum or a dad or a carer or a guardian?
I think it's a really good point that you raised because really, like those kids at that age, we have the camps for the kids from the ages of 9 to 12. We'll get a few sort of mature 8-year-olds as well. That's okay. But the idea is that we're all changing always, right? Change is the only constant, but kids at that age are undergoing a lot of change anyway. What we find is that up until about the age of 7, kids have undergone, that's one really key window of neuroplasticity. Then there's a bit of a stabling off until adolescence comes about. And that's why we capitalise on that moment to kind of really connect with them. Once, we can actually talk to them a bit more reasonably and a bit more openly and honestly than we could when they were younger. But they're still in this sort of intense dynamic process of change, and they will be. And kids are always changing. And so I love how you've kind of hit the nail on the head, is that these camps are not about going in there and changing our kids. More often than not, it's about giving us the opportunity to change the way we see things and to come at things from a different perspective. And when you ask what perspective are they coming from, there's multiple different perspectives. There are dads that just have been craving this opportunity but know that in our lives we don't get them. Like life is busy. The logistics of life is pretty crazy. So actually having somebody else to carve out that time and tell you can't have your phone, you can't have this, you can't have the other. Like some people really appreciate that. Some people are kind of blindsided by their wives. Usually they will book their husbands and kids in because they can see that there is a need for a change, or there is a need for greater connection, or a need for this opportunity to just set aside the pressures and stop just talking at your kids and telling them what to do, but just really listening to them and allowing them to listen to you. Sometimes we get dads that come and the first thing they say is, "There's nothing wrong with me. Our relationship's great. There's nothing wrong with our relationship." And it's a common thing that we hear when we invite people to the camps is, "Well, there's nothing wrong with it, so why would we go to this camp?" And thankfully, we have some mechanisms to actually get through that. But the whole idea is that there doesn't need to be something wrong with you to want to connect with the people that you love. But we know that with masculinity, we tend to avoid help-seeking behaviour. We don't engage in preventative forms of health maintenance. We tend to wait until it is a problem before we get it seen. And of course, I wonder how sustainable that is. And I also wonder, certainly in relationships, if we get to the point where it's broken. I mean, I think it's never too late, but I would hope that we don't have to wait till it gets to the point that we're broken to want to do something about it, to want to work on our relationship.
Yeah. One thing I really want to talk to you about, Monty, is your thoughts around building respect in young people and particularly in boys. And again, currently in Australia and worldwide, we're just seeing so many challenges around raising healthy boys that are respectful, that they understand boundaries, they understand place, and they have a sense of connection to who they are, but also and how they relate to others. I know you wrote a great piece that I read on social media, a couple of weeks ago. Are you able to share some of your thoughts around how, as parents and guardians, we can really build young men of respect that are aware of themselves and aware of others?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for me, respect. Like, I don't want to seem like too much of a cliche that you got to give respect to get respect. Like, you can't command and expect respect. But what I know is that a lot of the work I do, we run programs on race and gender and just acknowledging and accepting diversity, which is a big part of anthropology. But the whole idea is that, coming from that place of empathy and understanding first and foremost is the thing that engenders that respect and actually creates boundaries that are not given from above, but are actually thought of and chosen by the individual because they see the other person as a person rather than as a woman or as a person of colour or as a person of a particular socioeconomic background. They're not looking at the surface level mask or facade or the label that's placed upon them. They're actually understanding or getting a sense of who they are as a human being. And it's that connecting through humanity, which is sort of at the centre of all the work that we do. Certainly with regards to gender and healthy sexual relationships, for me, I like to move away from the transactional model, which essentially is about what can I do or what can't I do before I get into trouble. A transactional model, which is generally based on like a litigious or a punitive framework, which says, these are the things, these are the boundaries as set down by society. And I think that it's important to have them. It's important to have very clear and consistent boundaries. But my experience is that with young people, they don't have any investment to actually practice those or be conscious or considerate or intentional around those in the moment, because for them it's just a black and white thing. And human relationships, human experiences, ethical questions are not black and white. So I think that the best thing we can do to actually train them or set them up for success to deal with those complex questions that are inevitable in a complex world is to help them to understand the complexity of our humanity, and that starts with empathy. I think for me, a big part of empathy is first and foremost insight and awareness into yourself, because we can't actually ever understand what somebody else is feeling. We can only project on the basis of what we understand about ourselves. So insight is essential. Insight to yourself, that sense of connection and emotional intelligence and self-awareness and self-reflection is important. And that becomes the foundation for empathy. And when you have insight and empathy, you can much more responsibly manage those interactions, those complex social interactions, which young people and adults find themselves in all the time.
Yeah. So if I'm at the dinner table or something like that, can you give us an example of a conversation that you might have? I remember recently speaking with Robert Blum on a recent podcast and talking about, just calling out the everyday things that you see, this idea of monitoring and actually saying how you feel about it as a parent or guardian, and then inviting a response, about, someone's representation or how you might have seen something happen in a film that may actually have not been respectful of someone else or may have represented someone else in an overly simplistic or, as you were saying, transactional way. Can you think of a good example?
Yeah. Like we just had one the other day. So my son's turning 14, so we have these conversations quite a bit. And my daughter, she's 10, so she's super clever. And so we have these sorts of conversations all the time. I think
takes after her mum.
I mean, yes, absolutely. Hey? Done well to keep it up until now, my friend.
That's right. You're just getting started.
I think there are layers to it, Ray. There are layers. I think one thing that we do is we normalise conversation at every level, not just at the high stakes level. So you kind of have to build that culture and that norm within the household. So we share. Like I share my boring day. I talk about my boring day so that we normalise that story sharing in a way that doesn't have high stakes. And a lot of kids don't know when it is sort of really important to come and talk to them. So they'll often censor and regulate and not come to you because they think it's not important enough or not a bigger deal enough. And so by normalising that process of just sharing stories and not making them contingent on big, extravagant, exciting events, you set the conditions for a culture of sharing in a household, which is really important. And then, so again, with gender, a lot of the work I do in gender, I work in the construction industry or in the army, and you can't tell people to kind of set aside an aspect of their identity that has defined them for so long. You're actually taking something away, and in doing so, you're going to shut down the conversation. And this is one of the issues around Me Too or, the gender, the big issues around gender at the moment is that the way that we're approaching it tends to be, someone on one side and someone on the other side, and both people trying to convince the other person of what is right and what is wrong. And what tends to happen is you just reinforce the position of both of those separate sides, and you keep going off in the other direction, but feeling frustrated and resentful of the other person. And so the whole thing there is that when we engage with these conversations, we want to create sort of the emotional and psychological safety, and also the humility, which is based around not trying to convince them of my perspective, but really try to understand their perspective. So again, coming from that, so by modelling that perspective of empathy and understanding, I'm showing him how we engage in these difficult conversations. And by trying to really to get a sense of where he's going, and just do even just Socratic questioning, to really understand it without judgment. Often he's able to process it for himself because he's a good person, right? And just by questioning in a way that helps him see the humanity, rather than trying to catch him out, you go, hey, that's the bit I've got you on, because then you're just going to, shut him down. It's just listening and talking and having faith in the fact that, we've raised him with good values, and he sees us being good people. And I want him to make that decision for himself. So we talk about it. We talk about it openly without judgment, and we explore the perspectives, and we explore, we have a big thing around intentions and outcomes. So, I make mistakes all the time. I'm not perfect. I offend people all the time, right? And the question is, what was your intention? We always talk about feelings, and I think Lara often threatens the kids when they're acting up. She goes, "Do you want me to get your dad to come here and get you to talk about your feelings?" No,
not dad with his feelings. Too good.
But we do that. Just identifying and labelling those feelings, understanding the causes and consequences, thinking about what was your intention, because the intention might not have been to harm, and if it was, well, that gives us an opportunity to explore further. And then thinking, well, okay, whatever your intention, what was the consequence? How did it make the other person feel? And look at how are they feeling? Is that what you wanted? If not, well, how can we make it right? And again, just empowering them to process it for themselves rather than telling them what to think or do. That's how you build those muscles, really.
Yeah, great. So, and I guess just in sort of feeding that back, you're talking about a culture, having a culture where people basically have a lot of dialogue and there's a lot of listening going on and people genuinely and authentically sharing. And then you've just sort of introduced a bit of a framework that the parents could use about, what's your intention and what's the consequence, and getting kids to think a bit about that is really fantastic. Earlier I mistakenly said ethnography. I meant anthropology, of course. My apologies, and thank you for not publicly just totally correcting me right at the start of the podcast around that. Just going gently, Monty, on that. But tell us a bit about anthropology, because it does. It does inform so much of what you do. You are the everyday version of that. You are the embodiment of it. How does it inform your work? And maybe even just to illustrate with a story, as I know you've done some amazing travel and work in India and other places where that was very formative in how you see the world and where you've sort of taken your career, having been in academia.
Yeah, look, the idea that I live and breathe in anthropology is precisely the point. So anthropology is not just something you learn from a book. It's something that you have to do to really understand. You can only learn it through doing. And so, broadly speaking, because here's the thing, I assume everybody knows what anthropology is, but actually I found out that they don't. And one of the things
I don't even know what it's called, Monty. So
he doesn't even know what it's called, and I didn't shame you because this is a safe space, my friend. You're safe here. And anthropology essentially is the study of humans. And so I'm fascinated by not just the species of humans, but our humanity. So all the other stuff in between. And the reason why I love this is because I'm fascinated by how we've evolved physically to be this flawed physical species you see before you, my friend. Some more flawed than others, I might add. But how this flawed species, and I say flawed because our flaws are actually central to our humanity. The fact that we are flawed is the reason why we need each other, which is kind of a really important thing, right? So, I'm really interested in how this flawed physical species has been able to adapt and change and migrate to nearly every square inch of the earth. And I'm fascinated by how we've been able to do that and not just survive in those different places, but thrive in those different places. How we've had to move because of changes in population density, changes in climate or culture or environment. And that's forced us to decouple from a way of seeing or being or doing things and adopt and come up with new and innovative ways of being in the world to enable us to survive and thrive in a new environment with new conditions, potentially new people. To me, that speaks to the power of human diversity and variability. And it's why I do the work that I do, is because, we need to, our diversity from a genetic level right through to a cultural and a social level is the secret to our survival, the secret to our success. Our humanity and our imperfection, strangely enough, and our variability is our superpower. It's the very thing that's enabled us to be able to speak to each other in different states through a computer and talk about what it means to be a good human or a good person, right? And I think that's amazing.
So why is it that sometimes it seems to be the thing that separates us and that people build up so much tension and resistance about?
It's funny, isn't it? So humans are sensing creatures. We are, because of our brains, because of our bodies, because of our ability to think critically, creatively, to take different perspectives, we're constantly analysing and assessing and processing information in the world. I mean, all animals are, right? But in order for us to retain that information, we have to do things to it. We have to structure it. We have to codify it. We have to classify it. It's impossible to be constantly processing all the time the information that is coming at us. So we need these internal structures. We need physical structures like books or artifacts of material culture or thought objects, whatever you want to call them. We use these things to help us process, store, and recall vast amounts of information. In terms of your specific question, in order to codify and classify the world, we create these kind of cognitive boundaries, cognitive pigeonholes, if you will. And the problem is that when we live with those cognitive pigeonholes for a certain period of time, we assume those pigeonholes to be natural and innate and unchanging and universal. And the beauty of anthropology is that by going to lots of different places where people have lots of different kinds of systems of classification and categorization, we can actually help people realize that there are many different ways of categorizing the world. Now, we can see that throughout history and across space, across cultures, the way that the things that we think are normal, the things that we think are eternal, may not actually be that way. And by doing that, we offer ourselves an opportunity to see things from a different perspective, because we can decouple from the norm or the expectations or the ways of perceiving the world and offer ourselves new alternatives, creative or innovative alternatives, to enable us to adapt and change to the changing world. And so that's the beauty of anthropology for me. It gives us an opportunity or a lens to see the world. We can see things differently. We get to challenge the norms and the expectations. I mean, Gillian Tett wrote a great book called The Silo Effect. She's an anthropologist who's also she's a journalist with the Financial Times, and she predicted the global financial crisis because she was looking at all these people who were applying these categorical ways of seeing the world and taking for granted that this is the norm, that they couldn't see this thing when it blindsided them. But because she was able to take a step back and see things from a broader perspective, she could look at the different ways that people made sense of the world and could join the dots in such a fashion that gave her an almost predictive capability. And that's what I love about anthropology. I mean, we use that in the facilitation. We use it in how we design experiences in the classroom. We use it in the way that we understand communities and draw information from them so that we can hold the complexity of human experience, the complexity of human culture, the complexity of human agency, and actually report that back to people in a way that helps them understand the world that they live in and to understand their lived experience.
And so and I guess, hearing this as a parent, particularly again in those earlier years, I'm thinking just about the value of, meeting different folks and having different kinds of experiences, being in different places, listening to different kinds of music, really stretching some of those boundaries, because what you're also talking about is a much, I guess a deeper level or deeper way of understanding the world that even, many adults I think would find quite challenging. We see every day, people trying to categorize and set things up in binary. It's this, it's deductive, it's this, it's not that. And what you're suggesting for young people through stories is that, getting them to start to be familiar with different perspectives and that people may have different views on things. And going back to your earlier sort of framework that you were using, which is, what are your values, what's your intention, and what's the consequence here?
Yeah, and that gives people the agency to choose, right? Because I think, being exposed to diverse experiences is precisely how we learn. Because as soon as we are aware of our options, we have choice. As soon as we have choice, we have agency. So this is the thing: is that when you've been brought up in one way for so long, and you think that's the only way, you're not aware of the other ways of doing things. And this is, even just down to the way that we process memory, process information. We don't just do it in our brains; we do it through our bodies. I'm talking to you now, gesticulating, and when I try to remember things, I use my hands to remember things. In the Lukasa memory boards in Africa, they use these sort of they put shells and beads on these timber boards, and they use them as a way of remembering lots of information. And so the reason why I say that is because somewhere along the line, we assume that processing information, understanding the world is a purely mental, cognitive, psychological thing. And so, when we look across cultures and we look across time, we realize that processing information is so much more than just in the mind. It's in the body, but more importantly, it's in our relationships with each other as well. If we tell a story of an experience we've had together, we're both telling that story. We're both contributing to that meaning-making process. And that's one of the greatest things that I've learned through anthropology, the value of our relationships, the value of things in the world, the value of our bodies to process information and give us the ability to make choices, ethical choices, and to not have that locked in our brains or locked in some sort of neat linear framework or decision-making matrix. And it's actually much more messy. But I think that we need to learn to embrace that complexity and that messiness, because the world is messy, life is messy, and if we hold too tightly to simple our ways of understanding what it means to be a good person or what it means to be a good man, I think that when life does become hard, we're not equipped to do it.
Yeah. I think another challenge is that, you're talking earlier about the material and the relationship to the material. So we make a monument out of a moment, and then we forget that monument is is a, to use your earlier framework, the monument's a consequence of someone's intention. And then you look at it, it may be completely different, and we live by rituals that we live out every day. Some are thinking and some are unthinking, but we assume, I suppose, that from what you're saying, and we assume that there's inherent meaning in these rituals and monuments or these outcomes, but actually it may not be, and they actually may in turn, I guess, imprison our way of thinking or restrict our way of thinking, because from what you're saying, it's better to be thinking in a more diverse way, that actually our experience of the world needs to occur between people and amongst people in a sort of a co-inhabited way, rather than sort of an outcomes-based way.
Well, I would argue, so you're absolutely right. These artifacts of meaning, these symbolic structures that live in the world, we've created them, we've constructed them, right? So they only have meaning because of the meaning that we've invested in them. But it doesn't mean that that's still incredibly meaningful. It shapes the way that we interact with the world, right? So understanding that those meanings are arbitrary and that we've made them, that doesn't mean we still can't engage with them. I can still engage with the symbol of masculinity or the symbol of or a whole range of meaningful symbols, but I have a choice about which parts I want to use, because I don't believe that it is somehow universal or innate or natural or eternal, right? So being able to question them doesn't mean we have to reject them. It just means we can, because culture and symbols, they've all come from somewhere. They've all changed over time, but we assume that they're eternal because we don't have that historical perspective. And so if they have changed, they can change. And we can choose which bits we want to keep and which bits we want to let go. Just like the same way that we do in rites and passage camps or deep reflective transformative practice or transformative learning. We sit back and we reflect, well, what am I doing well? What do I need to let go of? What choices do I need to make to get me to where I want to go? As opposed to just reproducing the way that you've done things because you've always done them that way. And so this aspect of symbols and structures and objects being invested in meaning is really important. But I think it's equally important to recognise that those things don't just have meaning that is pushed upon us, that we're constantly engaging with them and we're constantly creating meaning around those things through our interactions, which is why when we talk about respect and gender and race and equity, one of the things I say is that the world is not the way it is because it's full of evil, raping men, right? It's actually the opposite. The world is the way it is, and it's filled with beautiful, empathetic, complex, sensitive, compassionate men. And so one of the big things men say, that statement around masculinity is not all men. I sit back and I think, well, actually, that's proving the point. When you say, not all men are doing this, to me, it proves that we don't have to be like that. We don't, that being evil or violent or vicious or imposing is not a natural condition of masculinity, because not all men. And I don't want to co-opt the hashtag and normalize it, but what I am suggesting is that we can actually make a difference through little acts, because it's in our little intimate interactions that we get to shape the culture. It's through our conversations that we get to shape the culture. And if we don't call out the stuff that we want to let go of, then we're complicitly reproducing a culture that is potentially dangerous. So we don't have to be a bad person to reproduce it. We just have to make a choice, conscious or otherwise, not to change the way things are. And if the way things are inequitable or oppressing a group of people, then we're part of the problem. So we can actually do something about it. And the fact that not all men are like this actually provides me with a lot of hope.
Yeah, and it's about agency, as you're saying, and it's about options. And, through dialogue, particularly with young kids and boys, when we're talking right at the start of our chat today about respect, it's about unpacking and enabling them to see other options, better ways of being that they can start to connect into. I just want to take you across.
Can I just jump in? Well, I think a really important part of that, when we're creating that kind of community of inquiry or that culture of growth and learning and self-reflection, is to actually make it so that you can actually you can make mistakes in that process. So this is where having those conversations with trusted people, especially around those big topics, we're stepping away from this idea of when I engage in a conversation about gender or sexuality or porn or drugs with my boy, I'm trying to get them to see it from my perspective. Stepping away from that transactional model and actually giving them the space to be able to explore the different ideas and make mistakes. That's really important as well. That requires the trust and the respect that I was talking about before, and we have to model that to create those conditions and that culture in our homes.
Yeah, great. That's a really important point. I'm actually, I love it. So just to recount it again. So you're saying stepping away from, an outcome, like sort of focusing, and again, you're talking going back to your earlier model, stepping away from just having a consequence, but enabling that intentional idea to sort of sit there, which is, I want you to understand what's really important here. And then enabling them to actually talk about it and form a view.
Yeah, if they're going through the process of assessing the relevance of that ethical decision for themselves, then they're so much more personally invested in it, and there's an emotional quality to it. There's a human, empathetic quality to it. And if they come to it on their own, then that's embedded.
And it's a really different role for a parent, isn't it? It's not the traditional parental role. It's not the role that we might play when they're really little. In some ways, like, in terms of really setting up boundaries around safety and so on, because as they get older and they're starting to think more and engage more and their issues are coming to them and they're seeing more, it really is a different parental role.
Well, we were talking, my mum's in the hospital at the moment, right? The role of the parent and the relationship with the parent is constantly changing. And I think the issue is that when we sort of assume that it is fixed at a particular stage, that's when we do ourselves a disservice, right? So it's constantly changing, and that can be really, really hard. Really, really hard. And I sit back and I think of when the kids were really little, and I'm like, I had no energy, but geez, it was great because they just did what I said, and, they couldn't really go that far. And now it's all completely different, and it is hard. And so it's not just the young people that need a space to explore these ideas and these perspectives and these options, to have agency and investment. We do as parents as well, which is why in the camps, it's not just for the kids. And more often than not, it's for the parents.
Yeah. So we're talking with Monty Badami from Habitus, an anthropologist, and covering a lot of fantastic ground. If people are interested as well, you jump onto your website. He's got a fantastic website with lots of interesting ideas, habitus.org, giving you life hacks to be a good human. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, Monty, was, and the kids are a little bit older, and I know you run programs at the Army, in business, in the corporate sector, at universities. One of the programs that you run is around, I'm not racist, but, and another one is, men after #MeToo. Are you able to share just a little bit about your process around engaging people around, a couple of those key issues? We sort of touched on a little bit in the diversity space, but perhaps if we focus a little bit on what you work through in the I'm not racist, but space.
Yeah, look, they're both built on the Brave Conversations framework, which is fundamentally about shifting from that transactional model of interaction to a transformative one. And when I say transformative, it means when we engage in a conversation, we're not trying to convince the other person of our perspective. We're not trying to win. We're not trying to go, if I tell you this, you'll believe that. That's a transaction. But it's more about a transformation where we both learn to understand each other's perspective. And so we have some specific tools and frameworks to do that. And we teach participants how to actually use them through an experiential learning framework. But ultimately, we come from this position. And look, I know a few things about gender and race, right? I've done it. I've got some skills. I've got some tricks. Got a
PhD.
I've got a PhD.
You got a doctorate?
Yeah, mate, you do too. You're giving away a dime a dozen.
That's it. Who doesn't? Who doesn't have one?
He doesn't have one, mate. So the challenge is, there's interesting because I come into it as Dr. Monty Badami, and it holds a symbolic capital. But I don't come in there as the expert. What I do is I try to really, I create a series of activities that remind them that they're actually the experts of their own experiences. And I'm trying to elicit that through the workshops, and really coming from this perspective that I don't have the answers. I've got loads of resources, but my job is not to convince you, because if I sat here trying to convince you, then I'd be a hypocrite, right? I'll give you resources. I'll give you access to all my resources, but my point here is to help you to just ask some questions, and to acknowledge your own privilege and your own prejudice, because we all have it. Everybody has it, even me, even you, Ray. Even you have prejudice, right? And the point is, we're human, enculturated beings who've had families and experiences. We've all got prejudices, because a prejudice is kind of a living example of how we categorize the world, which I talked about before, how we codify the world. And so if we can own it, then and then connect with other people empathetically, then we have the opportunity to make a choice. Whatever that choice is, it's up to you. But what I have found, and we sequence the events and the activities in the workshop in such a way as to slowly get them to be more vulnerable, to take off their masks, to be more connected. And we use story, we use gameplay, we use playfulness and joy and fun as a really important mechanism. And it by doing it in a certain order, in a certain sequence, we get them into the space of emotional and psychological safety. And whether it be in the corporate sector, whether it be in the army, whether it be in these workshops, that's the place you want to be. When people feel emotionally and psychologically safe, when we do studies on high performance teams, etc., that sense of safety, that ability to contribute, the value of diverse perspectives, the normalizing of dissenting ideas and saying, actually, it's really good that we are challenging each other if we do it respectfully and if we take risks and make mistakes for the sake of growing, coming from a good place of intentions, then it doesn't matter. We can have these big conversations because we are acknowledging our privileges, we're connecting empathetically, and we have a space and an opportunity to make a choice. That's the foundation of those brave conversations, and they apply really well for both in the gender and the race areas, but we've been able to extend them into other areas as well, like mental health and well-being, relationships in the family, those sorts of things. And I know that I didn't specifically answer your question about race, but I think it's the framework and the foundation and the methodology that is so important, because then we can engage in a whole range of other big, sticky conversations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the listeners can really get a sense of your approach. And as I said earlier, if you check out, habitus.org, or if you have a listen to Monty's podcast, he's got a great podcast, The Meaning Of, which is brilliant, a lot of fun, and really encourage people to jump on and have a listen to that as well. Yeah,
with Dr. Tim Dean, another bloody doctor.
Where'd you get his one from? Crikey. Okay. I'm conscious of our time and of our time together, and I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask you, and I have a feeling it'd be wonderful if we're able to get you back on the podcast to talk again and dive into a few more issues, particularly as they become, part of our, the work that we're doing at Understanding Boys. But just to round things out, if you had a story that you could tell a 14-year-old and he'd listen, what would the story be?
I had a good think about this. There's a really important story that has shaped my life, and it was how I came to do my work and become an anthropologist. Now, I started off in uni I wanted to become a psychologist, and at the time I was studying psychology and philosophy. I think I was about 21 years of age and was travelling through India with my family, and somehow had this opportunity to do some sort of cross-cultural mental health research in an Indigenous community in southern India, and was taken on as part of this diagnostic research team to go in and go to all these tribal villages and diagnose people and give them medications, right? And the place that I was at was a place called Wayanad in South India in the state of Kerala, and it's just a gorgeous location because if you think of India, that lovely peninsula on the southwest coast, there's like all these beautiful tropical beaches. And then it goes right up into there's some volcanic mountainous ranges, about an hour and a half inland. And those ranges are called the Western Ghats. And beautiful, really rich vegetation, lush, gorgeous area. And it's an absolute delight to the senses, right? So, it's green. There's national parks and wildlife there, right? So you can hear elephants and you can hear big cats and you can hear monkeys and birds. You can see the green vegetation. It's so beautiful and lush that it became sort of a central point for the Indian spice trade. And so it came to be known as the Spice Bowl of India. And so it's not only a delight to the sense of sound, but it's a delight to the sense of sight. You can see colours, reds and yellows and oranges and greens and blues. It's absolutely gorgeous. But you wake up in the morning in a place like this with all the plantations, you can smell coffee beans growing. You can smell tea growing in the plantations. You can smell cardamom, vanilla beans, turmeric. It's absolutely a delight to the senses. And it's got this bustling kind of trade, so you can hear big trucks in the background. But it's really gorgeous. But it was all driven, it was all sort of set up on the back of these Indigenous people who were exploited as a labour force. first by the Indian agriculturalists, then by the colonialists, and then by the agriculturalists again after the colonialist rule ended. And so, in this place of great sort of beautiful place of real wealth and richness, you've got some extremely marginalised people, people who are not even on the caste system. In fact, they were off the caste system, and these are people who are actually slaves. And the people that I worked with, the name was slave, translated to slave, funny. And so, amazing wealth, amazing richness, but amazing inequality and exploitation. And so we'd go around to these different places, and I was there with the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurological Sciences, and we'd rock up to these different villages, and, we'd go around, we'd set up a table, and we'd get a big leather-bound book, and we'd write down names, we'd point to people, you've got psychosis, you've got schizophrenia, you've got depression, you've got anxiety, here, have a pill. And then we'd bugger off, and no one would go back there for another year or so, and they'd probably give these people 1 or 2 pills to get through. And I was just amazed, and I just didn't understand what was going on. And when I'd talk to the Indigenous people in these primary health camps, I'd be like, what's going on for you folks? You're getting all these diagnoses, and they would say to me, well, yeah, okay, sure. Or like, maybe that's what the doctor says, but really what we've got is spirit possession. And my mind was blown away. The possibility that these people could think of things that I assumed to be very normal in a completely different way kind of blew my mind. And then I had to think about it, and I was like, well, these people, they don't have access to healthcare. They don't have access to a whole heap of things. And a lot of the times they were just prescribing, stress medications or depression medications and not doing anything about, social inequality, exploitation, excessive hard labour, substance abuse that comes along with being extremely marginalised, for example. And so they had their own system of understanding these ailments and their own system of dealing with it, which was spirit possession and having community rituals and events to actually deal with it and tell stories around it. And my mind was blown. And in this moment, I was 21, and I think I'd just read Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, so I thought I was pretty cool, right? I thought it was, really new age and stuff. And I don't know if you've read it, but there's this part of it where he sits by a river and watches the river flow by, and that's where he gets his sense of meaning of life. And I'd just been at these camps, and I was 21, and we'd crossed this river to go to another village, and we just stopped for a minute. And I sat down. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to take a moment to reflect on this. And we sat by the river, and I was all zen and yeah, totally into it, right? Thinking I was just bloody awesome. And I was sitting there, and I want to take something at this moment. I want to take something to remember it. And so I reached down into the river, and I picked up a stone, a little river stone, stuck it in my pocket. And we tramped up the top of this mountain to see this old village chief who claimed to be about 130. Now, he may not have, he probably wasn't, right? Like the average life expectancy for these folks is about 40 years at best. The guy was old, though. He could have been well into his 80s. And time's a funny old thing. But the guy was really old. Anyway, we're sitting and talking, and I'm like, really getting into the conversation. And he points to my pocket. He says, mate, you've got... He didn't say mate, actually. He just...
Hey, buddy.
Hey, buddy. Wait, pal.
The story's going so well.
Yes. But he did. He looked at me, and he pointed at my pocket, and he said, you have something of art. And I was like, oh, my gosh, well, I haven't done anything. I was really spooked. And he reached into my pocket, and he pulled out this stone. And he said, this stone is actually a part of our land, and it's as a part of our land, it's a part of us. And you can't take a part of us without taking the stories that are embedded in it. And he said, oh, look, I don't have a problem with giving you that stone, but you're not ready to hear those secrets yet. And he tied it up with a piece of twine, and he gave it back to me. I'm going to go back a little bit, Ray. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what was going on and why I wasn't ready to hear those secrets. Now, you know this story. I'm quite open about it, and that is that I grew up in an abusive household and struggled in my teenage years. And that caused a lot of complications for me. It's probably why I was drawn to understanding mental health and those sorts of problems. And so, at the time, I wasn't ready. I hadn't really dealt with all of those issues. Who deals with all of those issues? But that was an incredibly complex time of my life. And I wasn't ready to hear those stories, but strangely, just after that experience in India, I came to a bit of a crisis point. And, where I'd lost a lot of direction, and I didn't know where I was going, and a lot of things that I had held to be true had fallen apart. And the reason why I mention that is because it provides an understanding of why I do work with young people, why I work with boys and dads, and why I'm so passionate about understanding mental health and human experience and well-being in that context. But it features into this story because, when I went back to do my PhD and to work with this community, I learned that when somebody dies, that their spirit goes out into nature. And then after a while, that spirit of the ancestor comes back into the world of the living through the form of a stone. And for particularly important ancestors, it's amazing, right? And
it's incredible.
What's important? Yeah. It's incredible. This is a community that is a slave community, displaced. They have to move. They don't photograph. They can't read. They're not allowed to read. They're excluded from education. But they've got these stones, which becomes these little artifacts, these objects of material culture. They become a physical representation of the ancestor and the ancestor's stories. Deeds that have been done well, deeds that have been done badly. And they carry that with them. With particularly powerful ancestors, those stones are actually permanently located in or situated in particular locations all around the region. And so what's interesting about that is that the stone and the ancestor's story and the geographical location all become wrapped up in one. And what's even more interesting is that as people move around the landscape, they tell the stories of these ancestors. And in telling the stories of these ancestors, they're relating rich cultural knowledge about potable water, poisonous plants, medicinal plants, territorial boundaries, deeds, acts of bravery, acts of courage, acts of disrespect, acts, all sorts of things that are going on. They tell the story of their community and they learn about their community and they remember their community and they make sense of their community through these stones and through these stories and through their landscape. And when a person dies, it gets better, my friend. When a person dies,
just getting started.
Just getting started. When a person dies, they tell the story of their ancestors from the moment of creation right up until the moment of the most recently deceased. And no one ever learns it, and no one is ever taught it, but everybody knows it, right? And when they tell this song, and the song goes for 3 days, it's called the Penapartum or the body song. And when they tell this story for 3 days, and it's a rich invocation of ancestry and genealogy and history and topography and ecology and cultural story. And for me, where that blew my mind apart was that it was like these stones and these stories and these relationships and these rituals and these opportunities to come together become a mechanism through which we can not only process vast amounts of information, but store it and recall it and change it and shape it and use it to make sense of ourselves and our place in the world. And we make sense of it not just because of the stone, but because of the relationships we have in our community and the history and the connectedness we have to our landscape and the stories that we tell and the songs that we sing and the dances that we dance. It's an incredible story because it helps us learn about human memory, human processing. It helps us to learn about the importance of community memory, community storytelling. It helps us to remember the value of creative things like storytelling and play and ritual. And it tells us about the importance of things, the things in the world, not just the body. It's not up to me as an individual to make sense of the world because I have a relationship to other people and other things. But where it has been most valuable to me, and I relate this back to that period of crisis in between the two field visits, growing up with an abusive father, dealing with race and class and gender issues myself, there were moments in that period in between where I felt lost. And now when I look back, I see how, I've understood and made sense of my life backwards, but I've had to live it forward. That's the quote from Kierkegaard, right? When I was a young person at the age of 14 and life was a struggle, it was really chaotic. It was a crisis for a very long time. And whilst I may have had the illusion of competency and confidence at various points in my life, underneath it there was this struggle. It was by connecting with my humanity through this experience in my PhD that I was able to make my peace with the messiness, the complexity, the difficulties, the crappiness, the awfulness, the darkness that we all have inside of us, and make meaning out of that. But as I say, when I was 14, I could never imagine where I would be right now. And where I am now is precisely where I am supposed to be because of all that crap and all those crazy and wonderful and beautiful experiences as well. And having that opportunity to share in that story with those people has been a profoundly transformative experience in my life. And it's the impetus behind why I do what I do, but it's also really powerfully informed the methodology through which I practice.
Yeah. Wow. That's a beautiful story, Monty, and thank you for the raw and authentic way in which you've shared it. It's absolutely fantastic. I'm just so pleased that our listeners are going to be able to hear it. It's amazing. Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
My final question is, what is it to be a good man these days? Just on the back of that one. You might have just demonstrated it. Just another easy question.
Look, very simply, I was interested in this question and I was interested in how I might respond to it, because in my gender stuff, I would go, well, whether it's the traditional form of masculinity or the alternative form of masculinity, whenever anybody is defining what it means to be a man, they're still defining it. And that for me, I think can challenge some of the agency or the choices we might have. So I say, well, maybe it's not about being a good man or a real man. Maybe it's just about being a good human. And really, it comes back to something I've been saying all along, which is just that sense of empathy. But I would argue that sense of empathy towards yourself as well as others, because, we are flawed creatures. We make mistakes all the time. And I think that's really important. And we can't learn from those mistakes if we attach shame to it. Look, I have these 3 golden rules for teaching and parenting and coaching and leadership, and I think they're just 3 rules for being a good human. And the first one is just don't panic. Right? That helps us to not be reactive, and we can pay attention to what's happening in the world and be more responsive and more responsible. The second rule is don't take it personally. More often than not in life, it's not about you. It's not about me. And so that gives us the impetus to really inquire and try to understand if we're faced with challenges or we're faced with resistance. I mean, I say resistance is a window into a need not being met. Find the need and meet the need. And rather than getting curious enables us to actually develop those skills of understanding and empathy. And the third rule, which is I think the most important rule, is don't be too hard on yourself. Right? We're all just faking it till we make it. We're just human. But I would argue that our humanity is not just a throwaway fallibility. It is our superpower. As I said to you before, the fact that we are flawed and imperfect doesn't make us failures, it makes us human. The fact that we are human is why we need each other. The fact that we need each other is why we have cultures and communities. The fact that we have cultures and communities is why we've been able to survive and thrive for so long.
Dr. Monty Badami, thank you so much. Drops the mic, leaves the studio. You don't even have a mic because we couldn't get the mic to work earlier, amongst other things. But, you've been on your best behaviour for the best part of an hour now. You've dropped along with the mic, you've dropped some pearls of wisdom, and you really are. You're an amazing person to work with and to listen to. I just can't thank you enough for giving up your time, for sharing your story, your insights, your wisdom, and your thoughts. And we are huge supporters of yours here. We're incredibly grateful of the work that you've done with us over quite a number of years, and the practices that you've set up. In our own communities more locally down here. So thank you. Up at the not mid-central, it was southern New South Wales.
New South Wales, my friend.
That's right. It's probably
one
like
day
a
you'll
real.
Come here. You've threatened to come so many times. One day you'll actually get here.
It's COVID. It's probably a real sort of border thing, isn't it? Oh, don't call me a mid-central coaster. Like, what an insult. Anyway, we'll leave that one be.
Is a topic for another podcast.
Yeah, that's right. And on that note, thanks for your time.
I love you heaps, Ray. Thank you so much.
We hope you've enjoyed this Understanding Boys podcast. Make sure you subscribe on your podcast app, and please leave us a review to help grow the community. For more information about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.